always been about grassroots, always been about local. And between me and Jill Booth, my partner in these webinars, we'd always been talking about that when this comes to your doorstep, as it will, you will see it. And that's where, for many of us, our politicians and Wellington are not accessible, but your local councillors are the ones that, live, walk, and talk in your geographical neighborhood. So look after your own backyard. Look after your own backyard.
Hello, my name's Kate Mason, and it's the 27th of February 2023. And today I'm delighted to be speaking to Jaspreet Boparai. Jaspreet is a 44-year-old farming mother and wife who manages a 1,200 cow farm in Western Southland at the very bottom of the South Island of New Zealand. And Jaspreet and her husband, they're both ex-bankers, and they migrated to New Zealand in 2009, wanting to go large-scale farming, and that's what they've done ever since.
Sure. So my husband and I, as you said, we moved to New Zealand in 2009. It's been 14 seasons of dairy farming. So the dairy farming cycle, the season runs from 1st of June to 31st of May. And that's all we came out here to do, large-scale farming. We'd had enough of the corporate sector and had hung up our boots, swapped them for gum boots, and this was it. But it's a case, I think, of you can run, but you can't hide, for me, very honestly. And that's why it's a matter of, when we left India, farming was getting harder and harder. I have my father-in-law, he retired as a rural district bank manager, and he could see what was coming. And New Zealand was a place which was not propped up by subsidies. Late 80s, the Rogernomics saw them being phased out. But I would say within 2 years of coming to New Zealand, by 2011, the first couple of years was, heads down, bums up, and working hard. The lies are pretty obvious in the farming space. We have co-ops here that have been completely co-opted. And agriculture is everyone's favorite whipping boy, be it the climate issues, be it the road to net zero, be it generally, every other day putting some or the other story and talking about the social license of farming. And that's not to say that, every farmer is perfect. It's just like any other sector. There'll be some bad eggs. But farming especially has got such a bad rap here, despite the fact that last year, till 31st May 2022, 82% of New Zealand's exports came from the primary industries. It is not to say that agriculture deserves a free pass. Absolutely not. But to just single out one industry to hit it after, one regulation after another, it's just been completely crazy. And in 2017, our government, they set up something called the Special Forestry Test. And under this, they laid out the red carpet to foreign investors who want to come into New Zealand and buy vast swaths of prime pastoral land and convert it into forestry. And not indigenous, forestry. We are talking of exotic Pinus radiata, everywhere, blanket. And the country is now covered in vast swaths of pine, literally. And as the recent cyclone Gabrielle in the North Island showed, which has really hit New Zealand's food basket, that coast is everything from wineries to farming to beef to stone fruit. It's been absolutely hammered. And image after image shows you how those pines have literally been washed off, and they've just dammed up the rivers with the water having nowhere to go to breaching banks. We have silt 2 to 3 to 4 meters deep in places. And yet this was supposed to save us.
So what did they do with those plantations? So they were still cut. You were explaining that to me. They were cut, but the root system was left in the ground. And
so what happens is, they call it slash. So it's the byproduct left after, you've harvested. And again, about 4 or 5 years ago, the Greens claimed it a major victory that we stopped the clearing of the slash. It used to be picked off or burnt off or whatever that, no, too many emissions, and we are not doing that. That slash created just dams. There's aerial pictures, newscasters and others have gone on helicopters. It's just kilometers and kilometers of the coast covered with pine. And suddenly everyone, from our politicians to media, are just talking about climate crisis. Cyclone Gabrielle has shown us that 1 in 100-year events are not just that. No one's looking at what's most obvious. The forestry. Supposedly, these pines were being planted to claim carbon credits. Money literally grows on trees in New Zealand now, as I've realized, but no one seems to be speaking about that. Our price of carbon is really high as compared to most of our biggest trading partners, where it's about $20 a ton. Our exchange is currently, it's being traded at close to $80 a ton. For a sheep and beef farmer for whom this government, and it's done it for across the entire primary industries, you're going to be taxed for your methane and nitrous oxide on farm split level emissions. It is just getting too much to deal with. And everyone is planting pines. They had said it's going to be the right tree in the right place, but it's not. Where I live in Tuatapere, Western Southland, I'm, as the crow flies, I'm just a couple of kilometers from the Southern Ocean. Around me, within a 5-kilometer radius, 3 properties have gone into pine forestry. These were sheep and beef properties. They have been bought by 100% foreign investors. 2 of these have been bought by a Malaysian company, 1, I think, by IKEA. And someone tell me, how does this make sense? A company polluting elsewhere is planting pines in New Zealand to offset it. You are devastating rural community. It's not just the environmental impact, Kate. It's also the social one.
Yeah.
When you convert this, there are lesser jobs, lesser local contractors getting, work on these, because you plant and then you close the place for 25 years. It comes time to harvest it. And less children go to school, less families, our taxes, rates go higher. It just devastates rural communities. And then you have people at a, loose end. Just the effects on it have to be seen to be believed. And Central North Island is now bearing the brunt of this.
And what happens to the pine plantations? They cut them down and send them, or they keep them intact?
They send them overseas. So we swap something like $10,000 to $15,000 to $20,000 a ton of chilled meat exports to $100 to $150 a ton of pine at our ports.
Okay.
So whichever way you look at it, it makes no economic sense. And which is why the government bought in the special forestry test, because the key part of that was you no longer need to prove an economic benefit to New Zealand, because pines don't have an economic benefit to New Zealand. And before that, every foreigner, buying something here had to prove that it's economically a sound proposition. They no longer need to, and they couldn't, because it makes no sense. And here we are right now.
So it's the carbon credits, it's the letting multinationals in to buy the land, and then to be able to, and then it's the increasing taxes on farmers on the land in New Zealand, and the narrative that farming is actually, the biggest or one of the biggest greenhouse emissions, and needs to be stopped. The solution they talk about is synthetic biology and synthetic food. Is that much of that coming into New Zealand? There must be, because if you can't feed people from the land, where do you feed people from?
Yep. So there is Eat Crickets. This is a website. They have had different, forays into. They usually start from the schools, and they've had kids being offered that in school and see what does it feel like. And animal protein. You have social media influencers talking about veganism. And of course, I was sitting with my daughter, she's not yet turned 8. So her social sciences notebook again had this on the climate crisis and what is to be done, and how badly farmers are destroying the environment. We have weaponizing our young. The pines have, it's been 6 years now. 2017 is when the agenda really went on steroids. Suddenly, when this test came out, when they no longer had to prove an economic benefit, it immediately went nuts. But as time is progressing, the price of carbon is really increasing. And suddenly it's making far more economic sense. Around me, these 3 farms I mentioned, all of these conversions from, pastoral land to pine have happened in the last 12 to 18 months. So it is really picking up speed now. And I live in a tiny place of 500, give or take a dozen.
So when the cyclone comes through and it's all these pine plantations that have been, their roots still are in the ground, and they're just left there. So the cyclone comes through, and then what happens? It sort of rips it up. There's nothing really anchoring. That's a dead root, isn't it?
So the tree, they have harvested the tree. Only say 40 to 50% of it is suitable for, milling or further exporting. So whatever is left that they don't intend to sell or export, it's just left on the ground, because the green said that. It is hard to ignore. But no, the talk is all about how, extreme weather events are becoming more prevalent. And the place that was the hardest hit is Esk Valley. Esk Valley has had these floods 5 times in less than, just over 80 years. The 1937 ones were just as bad at the same place. But I guess we did not call it climate change, then we just called them floods.
Yeah, and then it's the land practices that have come in which aren't being talked about. So you mentioned earlier about Punjab and India and seeing the writing on the wall there with farming. What actually did you see in India? What's happening in India? Is this part of the Green Revolution?
It is. And the state that I come from, Punjab, Panj means 5, and it's so called because it's a land of 5 rivers that come down from the Indus. We're on the border with Pakistan. So Punjab was a wheat belt, a millets and lentils and those sort of hardy crops. In the mid-70s came the Green Revolution, and suddenly farmers in Punjab were incentivized to grow rice. Rice is very, very, very water intensive. That should have been left for the south of India. And Punjabis, we are also not, rice eaters much. We are more dependent on wheat and barley and stuff. Farmers were incentivized. A whole lot of water. The water table has gone drastically down. You have to, in some places in Punjab, the boreholes need to go down 80 feet to get any water. That has fallen. The fertilizers and the immense use of, sprays and whatever has wreaked its havoc. And this Green Revolution has literally destroyed a community that prided itself on being, the wheat basket of India. So much for diversification and whatnot. And I don't know if you are aware of it, but from September 2020, at the height of the Indian, autumn and the first COVID lockdowns and all, so farmers in India, at one point, over 500,000 of them were protesting in Delhi for 14 months till last year, so 21 December, and close to 700 died. And suddenly, within the COVID issues and lockdowns and all, the government tries to pass laws, because unlike New Zealand, subsidies are what makes Indian farming work. Because you're so small that you need the support before the big boys of the market eat you up. And we have Monsanto and Cargill already in India. And close to 60% of the population is still dependent on subsistent agriculture. So not large scale like here. So they again try to push laws towards a corporatization of agriculture. So in India, after the famines of the 30s and 60s, the government began a food security program. And the government would ensure an MSP, a minimum support price for farmers. So if you are planting rice or wheat or sugarcane or whatever, you know that this is the minimum I will get. And the farmers are given that because they are really small. You're talking of an average holding size of less than a hectare. So that's that. And during these change farm laws against which the protests happened for over a year, they said we are going to remove that. And, we need to open up our markets. We need to stop this protectionist regime and so on. So that failed. The government ultimately, after 14 months of these guys blocking one of the major routes into New Delhi, one of the highways, they relented. But now Gates is pushing forward a whole software to analyze data, and they have recruited people en masse. And what with the lockdowns and suffering economies, there's lots of people who have gone in for those data entry operator level jobs. So more than one ways to skin a cat.
So the Green Revolution, who brought the Green Revolution into India? Was it Rockefeller?
No, I wouldn't be able to give you the exact statistics, but a co-op was set up. This was in the mid-70s, so before I was born. But the government of the day, the Congress, which right now is not in power, this is Mrs. Gandhi's clan and everyone, they were the ones who set it up with the World Bank. So World Bank came in and lots of subsidies were given across the board to farmers, because for a place like Punjab to suddenly plant rice was a complete turnaround. Parts of Punjab, we are on the border. Rajasthan, with its massive sand dunes is next door, were desert-like. To convert that bit into rice has been devastating. The chickens are now coming home to roost.
And it was GMO rice, isn't it?
GMO is in India, yeah. Unlike New Zealand, where they are trying. Yep, India's gone down the GMO route a long time ago.
So I've only looked at Africa. I haven't looked at India. I've looked at Africa and what's happened in Africa with the Green Revolution there, and Gates and Rockefeller and the United Nations backing it. So when you say that you saw the writing was on the wall in India and then coming to New Zealand, are you seeing something similar?
Yeah, that's what I said, Kate. You can run, but you can't hide. The agenda is universal and it follows you. And there comes a point where you decide, how much am I going to run? This needs to be tackled. And just like you said, Africa, because of my family's involvement in the army and they're being posted there a good 30 years back, early 90s, with Dad in Somalia, Africa has also been something I have gone into in great detail that, how did the Green Revolution go there? And the results are not that dissimilar to what's happened in India.
And you're talking about the United Nations peacekeepers force, or?
Yes. So Dad has retired from the Indian Army. He's a lieutenant colonel, and our battalion, in fact, an entire brigade went, close to 5,000 men, because India, as a part of the Commonwealth, you have to have a certain number of troops in these missions. So you don't choose to go into it. You're just, they pick up the top battalions, the most decorated and exemplary records. So yeah, Dad was in Somalia between 92 to 94. I was in my early teens then. So it's been close to 30 years, because by some weird coincidence, and I think my dad and brother, I don't know of many other father-son duos in the Indian Army, because about 20 years later, my brother in the Indian Army, they were moved to Congo, again as part of the UN peacekeeping forces. Right. So Africa is somewhere where, I've just naturally been interested.
I've also had the similar sense that what's happened in Africa, India, other countries is now happening just all around the world. Everyone is now being basically under a corporate coup, and farming is being seen as this sort of culprit of the reasons why we have the climate agenda. And I think it's incredibly interesting. It would be interesting to track when it became the climate agenda and not looking after the environment, because if you look after the environment, you can then talk about farming and farming practices that are environmentally friendly and, look after the land. So now everyone talks about climate, and that removes it from anything. It's very abstract. And
but it's also very emotive. So it's very easy to get people, all up in arms about it. I don't know when I've last heard a sensible debate about the effect of nitrous oxide and methane, if any, on the climate, yet we are now going into a regime of being taxed on these two gases.
And so farmers are being moved off, multinationals are buying it, they get the carbon credits, and then they're also doing land practices which are incredibly damaging to the environment. And that's not entering into any public discussion, and it's just seen as any sort of agriculture is wrong and bad.
Exactly. And I have been guilty of being short-sighted myself. For a long time, I was thinking, this happens in maybe Asia and Africa. And it's only once I came here, and we came here just for agriculture, nothing else. We had, a pretty good quality of life, decent careers, and coming out here. And 2 years later, seeing that, jeepers, what have I gotten myself into? This is just another way, to reach the same end goal. If you look at Africa, and the very close ties of AGRA, African Green Revolution Association, with the United Nations. I mean, AGRA was headed for a long time by, I think it still is, by Agnes Kalibata. So she's a Rwandan refugee who was picked up from a very, poor family. She went to US on a Rockefeller scholarship, came back, became the Rwandan Minister of Agriculture, was it from 2008 to 2014? And then she moved on, and she was appointed the UN Food Envoy, United Nations Food Envoy. And you look at the state of Rwandan agriculture. Seriously, these are the people we are holding up as idols? And we have people like our, agriculture minister, Damien O'Connor, going and paying homage at the feet of these puppets. And this is the law that are going to tell New Zealand farmers or Australian farmers how to farm, the ones that have wreaked havoc on their own countries. Africa had very strong, low maintenance, very little negligible fertilizer regime crops. And those ones, their corn, their sorghum, millets, little inputs, little water, have been destroyed. They've been replaced by GMO stuff, which requires endless amount of fertilizer at a very high cost and is toxic and still doesn't work. Farmers get further into debt for their crops. And for a long time, the cotton from Africa, even if you look at that particular example, was supposed to be great. And now you have cotton from Pakistan suddenly beating that one because they have literally destroyed whatever the indigenous seed knowledge the people have. And wrecking agriculture there, we have had the same place, Ethiopia. A few years ago, the United Nations had put up this whole thing of we have planted, I don't know, it was well over 100 million trees in one day. And they were crying about the fact for climate change. And yet 2 years later, they're asking for food donations because sub-Saharan Africa is dying. So God help me. You are planting trees 2 years ago for biodiversity and God knows what else. And those people can't afford to feed themselves.
Yeah.
This is criminal. Absolutely criminal.
Yeah, it is. And making seeds patented so you can't share seeds. And then there's an organization in Africa.
Small food producers,
and there's hundreds of thousands of them. And they join together under this name. I'll put it up, the link to it. But they plead, stop AGRA, stop Gates, stop Rockefeller, stop the United Nations, stop funding this. It's destroying our communities. It's destroying our capacity to live. And there's hundreds of thousands of them and they get no traction. If you go to the United Nations, they're still they're still up there talking about AGRA being a wonderful thing on one of their pages.
And who funds AGRA? The Gates Foundation does.
Yeah, it's Gates, it's Rockefeller, it's Monsanto Bayer, it's Corteva.
And like the United Nations, the first I heard of it in Africa was 1959, when they spoke about that year being the year of Africa. Over a dozen countries got their independence from, Belgium, Germany, various countries in Europe. And United Nations said, yep, we are going to help these countries assert their newly acquired sovereignty. 60 years on, even if you look at Congo, when the UN boots were on the ground there before Christmas of 1959, the average Congolese barely reaches a lifespan of 60. A third of the kids are malnutritioned. Many of them, a vast majority, don't make it to their 5th birthdays or are stunted in growth. And Congo was its food basket. And look at it. All we do is now mine stuff for our EVs and a virtue signal.
Yeah.
That we drive a clean car.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And what is getting in the way of people understanding such fundamental human rights abuses of countries and including all of our countries and all of our people that are just working people who, put a roof over their family's head? And what is this absolute push to put everything in the hands of these massive corporates, the 0.01% who have had exponential wealth increases over the last few years in particular?
I think for many people, it's really hard to reconcile the fact that the government doesn't really care for them. It's really hard for most of us, are good, trusting people who can't believe that they can be, such evil. There are organizations just doing this right under their noses. And I also think, like, I'll now speak, I'm a Kiwi now. I surrendered my Indian passport in 2017. India doesn't allow dual citizenship. So this is home. The West has had peace for a long time. Places like New Zealand, Australia, they've been relatively peaceful, thriving. As I've said, I think on another forum, India had its last war against Pakistan in 1999, the Kargil War, and close to 700 troops died. And I'm not glorifying war, but I'm saying war gives you a message that this freedom is not free. There's somebody who died, that every tricolor wrapped coffin that came in to the country, some of them with, missing body parts in direct gross violation of the Geneva Convention. It brings home to you a fact that, this is not free. There is a bit of strife, and a war going on really brings home the reality about the struggle of those countries, whereas the West has had it relatively peacefully. And everyone talk. If you look up statistics on New Zealand, it is supposed to be, according to Transparency International, in the top 3. In the top 3 in the world where transparency is concerned. Yet the average Kiwi has no idea of what is happening. Everyone has a sense of something going wrong. Something is not quite right. My rates are going up every year. This is not right. Food inflation. Farmers are not actually that bad, but putting this whole agenda together and then add to it media. Never underestimate the fact of that gaslighting that's gone on. New World Order and this and that. People are so worried about getting that label of conspiracy theories that they just don't want to go there. And life is hard already. Inflation is so high. People have lost jobs. The mandates have taken a toll. Just day-to-day surviving in this is hard enough for people, then leave alone deal with this. They feel completely powerless. So I can see the attractiveness, of ignorance being bliss.
You've really taken up the fight. You have really stepped into, as you were saying, it's time to face this and not just sort of, try and find the next best thing you can do, or how can you move away from this? And it's time to turn around and say enough, and I have to have my voice heard. So where would you say that, where did that sort of start to happen? Was that in the last few years?
The last couple of years. I think for me, COVID was a turning point. I've seen people around me devastated health-wise, family relationships being shunned by, those who knew them for decades. This entire polarization was just too much for me. And polarization is probably something you're seeing in Australia, but out here in New Zealand, they have taken it to a whole other level, between everything suddenly being Maori and non-Maori. Pakeha is how they refer to a non-Maori. I don't know what category do I come in. I am neither. But suddenly this whole polarization, and it brought with it a sinking sense of deja vu that what I thought I left behind in India, because I'm a very small minority, the Sikhs are less than 2% of India, it has followed me here. I have young children born New Zealanders. What sort of future, and and that's probably a mom speaking here, what sort of future they have to look forward to? And for me, I don't know, it might be short-sighted. There are many people, who gun for bigger positions, central government and whatnot. For me, it's always been local. I think if each one of us sort of looks after our own geographical communities, not the global community and the global citizenship, not just your geographical community, the country will look after us itself. Look after your own backyard. And that's where last year I finally decided to throw my hat into the ring for our local community board positions, as well as a councillor position. And I was very surprised to make it to Southland District Council, where I am a councillor since October last year.
Yeah, and you were part of Voices for Freedom. You're still a part of Voices for Freedom.
So Voices for Freedom, for me, it's been a lifesaver. So this is a grassroots apolitical organization set up by three, as the media describes them, yummy yoga mummies. So yeah, they tried to portray these three ladies, Claire, Alia, and Libby, as just somebody with no other qualifications. But these are women who, between them, have a wealth of knowledge. Two of them are lawyers. They've all run their own businesses, and they set this up 2 years back. VFF, as the abbreviated name, to sort of speak up against the mandates, because we could see what was coming here. Inch by inch, they just kept moving. Now it's just going to be the border workers. It's just going to be the frontline staff. It's just going to be the teachers. It's just going to, if you need to go to a cafe, go to a hairdresser, you need a vaccine pass. And so I and a friend of mine, Jill Booth, who incidentally has also gotten into her local community board about 200 k's from me. Here, we've been doing webinars on VFF for a year and a half now, every fortnight, about the UN agendas and how we've seen it percolate down right to our very doorsteps, be it the civic education our kids are getting in school, or be it pine forestry. So VFF today has well over 100,000 members. We have chapters in over 100 locations. We have hand-delivered, close to 5 million flyers. This is a country of 5 million. And it's been great. It has been, as I said, a lifesaver for me and a lifesaver for many others, because I can tell you, when the iron rod came down, it came down pretty hard in New Zealand. We were like that, hermit kingdom, sealed away for years.
Yeah, it was bizarre to me, because I had this sort of love affair with Jacinda Ardern before all of this happened. This benevolent, lovely, maternal,
kind,
female figure that looks after her community, and then suddenly she became this dictator. But how divided is New Zealand about her?
Very, but I think her enduring legacy would be the polarization of this country. When I came here 14 years ago, I saw, at least that was my impression, I saw a very egalitarian society. There was no, massive issues like they now make out, that suddenly everything needs to be seen through a race-based lens. Critical race theory is being taught in our schools. It was nothing like that. Everyone just got along. And 2017, the government came into power. That time it was a coalition from 2017 to 2020. And 2020, they came back with absolute majority. And they have pitted everyone they could against the other. Vaccinated against the unvaccinated. Maori against non-Maoris. Employers against employees. Town folk against rural folk. The wedge has been driven very, very deep. And the media has played its own part in this, because without them, this wouldn't have happened. But suddenly now, everything needs to be seen, right from water, the well-being of water, to the well-being of our natural environment, the whole well-being UN agenda. These are amorphous terms without a legal definition, and yet here we are, changing our entire legislative system to accommodate these. But she was very open about it. It was 2019 in a Gatekeepers, which is, Bill and Melinda Gates would host that to map countries' progression towards the UN SDGs. So at the 2019 Goalkeepers Conference, she said that New Zealand will be the first country in the world to put the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals into its legislation. And man, they should deliver on that promise. We are one messed up country right now.
Where did she come from?
I mean, she's come through the labor ranks. She has been an intern with Tony Blair and Helen Clark. And I wonder where her next step would be. So she's very conveniently stepped down in January. When just before Christmas, she said, oh, yep, we'll be fighting the next elections. And come January, when the offices opened after the Christmas break, it was like, I've got nothing left in the tank.
Please explain the well-being coming down through the UN. How are you seeing everything that's happening in New Zealand? Is it just through the SDG goals and then the critical race theory? Are you seeing that as a UN agenda? Or how does that actually look? How is it being taught in the schools? I guess all of that, what you just said, I'd love to hear a little bit more about it.
I don't know if you've had a chance, these webinars Jill and I do, but the first slide has been the same in all of my, 40 odd presentations. It's the United Nations depicted as a Medusa. And I've always called it United Nations. Think of it as the exact opposite, divided nations. And this is where we are at. So at the schools, we have global citizenship education, how to be a better global citizen. We have, in this lockdown, changed the New Zealand school history curriculum to suddenly focus on ethnicity now, because it seems that everything I am today depends, I need to look at the whole world through this lens. We have had, again, the well-being, because they went, the mandates, and every time they were talking about all of that, they went really, really hard after Maori and Pacifica, the indigenous people, saying that, oh, these are the indigenous people and they are more vulnerable. The certain areas which are, more Maori dominated, there were vans everywhere. There were countdown or, vouchers given to enticements and whatnot. And yet suddenly they wanted a split healthcare system. So we are the country who, for the well-being of the Maoris, declared that a healthcare is racist because an average Maori lives 7 years, lesser in terms of total lifespan than an ordinary Kiwi who's not a Maori. And a $700 million split of the healthcare system on the basis of ethnicity. So this is our well-being. Mm. For water, we have created a new mega bureaucracy. We've created a new water regulator. We've named it Tamata ROI. And this is now going to manage the well-being of water, Timana ROI.
And what does
doing this?
What's the well-being of water mean?
Precisely. It's anything. And I can, think of some lawyers rubbing their hands in glee because it's going to lead to a whole lot of court cases and interpretations and whatnot. We have had indigenous biodiversity policies now come through. And yet it is the same people who are putting exotic pines across lands, regardless of whether they are sacred to certain cultures or not. And children, so well-being, climate well-being, racial well-being. So well-being, what does it mean? It means sustainable, a full belly. Kiwis are not able to afford that, and yet suddenly we're supposed to virtue signal towards every single thing. So this is our well-being now, a country in shambles.
Yeah. But you've been able to locate this as a United Nations sort of coming down the ladder. What would you say about the United Nations?
It is not an organization any sane country should be emulating. If you look at what they have done in Africa, that should be enough for us not to touch it with the barge pole. But my biggest issue is it's unelected, it's unaccountable. And yet every council document, central government law, look, they refer to IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are the models and this is what we are doing, or we need to work towards these SDGs. Hey, hang on a moment. We never elected these people. They've never come here. You never campaigned on these issues. So of course, Jacinda said at the Goalkeepers at New York that we are going to be bringing that in, but there was never any talk about this in the whole run-up to all her public appearances, which were dozens and dozens. And this is an completely unaccountable, out of control set of globalists destroying a country that had its warts and all, but was still a good, happy place to live. Right now, we are being regulated to within an inch of our lives. Inch of our lives. So if someone tells me that, these pines are saving us, or this suddenly taxing me for methane and nitrous oxide is going to save the environment, and you have conclusive evidence on anthropogenic climate change, let's have a sane debate. But that doesn't happen. So I think it's time to take the blinkers off and realize we are on a highway to hell.
And the United Nations has the 2019 partnership with the World Economic Forum, which is the 1,000 largest corporates in the world. I mean, that's enough. I mean, they have a history before that. They were started up on Rockefeller land back in the 40s, and there's lots of things in between, but it's a corporate front. It's a corporate front. They have corporate partnerships. They have the same people that the corporations they're in partnership with are the ones who are bringing in all the surveillance technology and the synthetic food industry and many more aspects of this new world we're entering into.
I absolutely detest now. I've come to detest, like Jacinda would say, be kind, the word partnerships. Public-private partnerships are the biggest rot ever. You
Yep.
get co-opted so fast, before you realize what's happened, you're completely out of control. And there's somebody else who's like selling you out. It's interesting that Klaus Schwab's book, The Great Reset, COVID-19, came out in May 2020. It was on sale on Amazon, and we were just 2 months into the pandemic, weren't we? And yep, he laid bare exactly what was going to happen.
Yeah.
But public-private partnerships, again, are handing over powers to these corporates, and who have absolutely nothing else but their self-interest in mind. And I've been seeing a few Australian bigger banks and corporates websites, and they seem to have a bit of virtue signaling on the websites that we honor those who came on these lands before us. And have you noticed those little bylines coming? So I was like, yep, that sounds a bit like New Zealand.
Absolutely. And I've been so shocked by the public-private partnership model in Australia, because it wasn't too long ago that we thought it wasn't okay for our government to be in bed with big business. And now it's being put forward as the way the big businesses are the ones who have to fund everything and profit off everything, and the government gives them kickbacks. And I'm just like, I mean, that's what the World Economic Forum talks about, that's the good thing. BlackRock talks about people now trust corporations more than government. But do people really believe that? Like, how?
And yet it is happening. Some of the biggest cycle trails in New Zealand have been built with public-private partnerships. Now, who gets the money out of those? That's a few niche tourism players, and of course, the ones who got the contract for carrying out those cycle works or road works or whatever. But the ratepayer who's seeing their power bill, their annual property taxes and everything, right, they are footing that. So you are actually using the public exchequer's monies to pay for private business.
It's the public money going up.
It's a scandal.
It's a scandal. Have you looked at the housing market and the affordable housing market? I'm still to look at that. Blackstone, who is the biggest landlords in the United States, they're making a beeline into Australia. They bought up huge amounts of properties when the property crashed in 2008 in the United States. And now they're coming into Australia with their build to rent schemes. And the government, the New South Wales state government, gives it's 50% less of land tax for build to rent schemes. And I'm still yet to work out the affordable housing component of this. But you know, what we're going to see is more and more places that are just built to rent, and it becomes less affordable for anyone to be able to buy their own property, and impossible with the land taxes and the value capture when they put in the infrastructure and everyone's rates go up. There's just all these pieces of the puzzle to see how people are going to be unable to have private ownership of anything, farms, houses, and yet these
we are a step ahead of you. So 2 years back, was it October 2021 onwards, for people who had properties, rental properties, landlords in New Zealand, they removed the deduction for the interest costs. So that's a 30% deduction just gone. And the whole thing was, now landlords are making a killing, or housing is a basic human right. Yep. But I don't know of any other business where your business expenses are not deductible, legitimate business expenses, but they called this a loophole and they removed this. The rents went sky high, property values soared. I mean, we are in a housing bubble right now. And I mean, look at food. Isn't food a basic human right? I don't know of any, major outcry of your dairies or your bigger supermarkets who've been suddenly told you can't deduct your interest costs on this. But there is it. That's only happened in New Zealand. And gosh, between healthy home standards, which are increasing every year, I've heard of people on various property investor forums talking about the rules are so ludicrous about how much heating has to be provided that some of them have put in temporary, partitions to split a room because a brand newly fit heat pump, 7.5 kilowatts, that's keeping the place warm. The tenant is happy. The healthy home inspector is not happy.
So you got
So
healthy.
all these gravy trains have
Yeah.
begun.
Okay. So healthy homes is about what, greening the home, having green infrastructure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. And I've seen more and more on Facebook, lots of Facebook pages like the Greens and whatever else, and they're targeting their vitriol, their anger. I understand young people. I understand they really feel incredibly disenfranchised because it's become impossible to own a house and to buy a house. I understand that, despair really of being able to have something that you can call your own. Targeted on, the boomer, the boomer generation that might have had one or two investment homes in their primary home. It's not targeted on these massive corporates who are doing build to rent schemes and own everything and are the biggest landlords in the United States of America. That's okay. Not saying this whole system's wrong. It's like, why is it ushering in just something that is so much worse? And then they will talk about it being capitalism and how awful capitalism is. And I just keep saying, well, what do you think this Blackstone model is? Isn't that the most revolting form of capitalism and, power over and just...
Yeah, maybe they would like to swap this for Cuba or Haiti instead. I don't know. Children these days, I worry about the education standards, or should one call it the indoctrination standards, what's going on.
Yeah,
At 44, I'm very grateful that I studied in a time in India where, academics was supposed to be your way out of this. And there you were studying without any emotions attached. They can't seem to do any history lessons here now without emotions there. I have a friend whose 16-year-old came back from school, a premier school in Invercargill, a sensitive child, rather upset. And her mom told me that the history lesson was delivered in such a way in her premier school, out of zone enrollment, that she came back feeling that as a white person, she is carrying the burden of that on her, and she wanted a note from her mom to get out of the next history lesson. This is what we are doing to our children.
Yeah.
And then we talk about youth suicides and youth crimes and youth not doing anything. And we have children. We have our Greens co-leader, James Shaw, talking about how he wants to see children carrying out rolling climate strikes from now on till the next election, and how the next election needs to be a referendum on climate. Now, our OECD standards for a Kiwi student are slipping, and they've been slipping over the last 20 years. No one seems to care. It's like you've got, climate hysteria ticked off, critical race theory ticked off, virtue signaling ticked off. Yep, right. Let's send them out.
So you've now gone into local council. You got in, you were successful. They did a bit of a hit campaign on you. You showed me them talking about you in a particular way. What would you say about that part of it?
Well, I need to thank them actually. How else would someone know a boring 44-year-old farming wife and mom stuck in the absolute backwaters of rural Southland? I couldn't buy that sort of advertising. Heck, I only spent $1,500 in total.
How did you get in? How did people know about you, and why did they back you?
I still ask myself that question because according to the media, I am a conspiracy theorist, and less than 2 or 3% of New Zealand thinks like me or is unvaxxed and so on. And yet I was second out of 9 candidates in my ward and had close to 30% of the vote. So I think Kiwis have a lot more credit than the media would give them, a lot more sense than the media would give them credit for. But I think I also have VFF to thank, because doing the webinars weekly, fortnightly for a while. But honestly, it is it's been just as much a revelation to me as it is to you. I never expected to be in this position where I am now. And
So Voices for Freedom did a bit of a campaign. It was a strategic campaign to get as many people into local council. Is that right?
yes, so about last year, February, we started asking people because, I am one of those who's guilty of not voting in the central elections. They don't matter to me. It's like a change of guard. You change one for another. For me, it's always been about grassroots, always been about local. And between me and Jill Booth, my partner in these webinars, we'd always been talking about that when this comes to your doorstep, as it will, you will see it. And that's where, for many of us, our politicians and Wellington are not accessible, but your local councillors are the ones that, live, walk, and talk in your geographical neighborhood. So look after your own backyard, look after your own backyard. And it sort of went from there. And then a few people started asking me, so have you filed your nomination? I'm like, I'm not. They're like, that's rather hypocritical. You've been encouraging others to do it and you're not doing it. But yeah, quite a few, I would say, well in the high double digits got into the local government at different levels. As per, looking through the VFF database and a few others, I know that it's well over 100 people across the country who've got in, be it at councils, community boards, and so on. So it has been an interesting journey, but I can hand on my heart tell you that when we began in the winter of 2021 doing these webinars, it's been a year of, and the mandates were coming thick and fast. Never expected the journey to lead it where it has. I don't have a single diplomatic bone in my body, much to my mother's immense concern at times. So I didn't expect to be here.
And what's it like? How are you finding it?
It is just the way I expected it. There is a whole lot of reading, dry as dust, that you're going through. But if you give it your best shot, and I'm the sort of person I like to read everything twice before I go into a meeting, it is very insightful. It is always going to be very humbling for me because there's those many people who repose their trust in me. I have lived into a Tarpuri for just over 2 years in this particular ward. I'm not exactly someone, who's been here for generations, like the person who got the most votes, whose family has been here for 4 generations. So I am very, very conscious of the fact that people have entrusted me with something and I need to deliver. And that's what I intend to do.
That's wonderful. It's what we need right now. I agree with you. We can't fight this globally. We have to push back about it. All of these things coming into our towns.
I find the signs encouraging. I mean, not just the fact that I've been elected, but the fact is more and more people are now coming up, speaking about things. And, one can't preempt the pain for everyone, much as one would like to. I know I have, like many others, run myself ragged trying to do that. But there comes a point when people have to feel the pain to, have to feel the pinch to suddenly realize something is wrong. And farmers are feeling it now with the food inflation, everyone feeling it. The traffic, the insanity of the road to net zero, between pavements being widened and suddenly from 70 you came down to 50 kilometers per hour to 30. Everyone is now slowly, and the agenda remains the same. The net zero is what is coming for farming. The net zero is what's coming for townies. And people are seeing it. And now with inflation, the way it is, there's a whole lot of people who are going to wake up in a hurry.
You've got all the 15-minute neighbourhoods and 20-minute cities in your plans?
I think New Zealand's a step ahead of the world in that regard, Kate. So we are, our demographics are, I think, pretty unique. So one city, Auckland, accounts for 1/3 of the country. 5 cities account for 80% of the population. So we are pretty much, sitting ducks for that. Close to 80% of people are already living like that. But there has been a pushback there, like the government with bipartisan, agreement between the left and the right, so-called conservatives, have passed legislation that allows high-density housing to be built up to 3 stories without a resource consent.
Without
And
what?
suddenly, without needing a resource consent,
Okay.
free for all. So you have a city, Auckland, from the city of sails turning into the city of shadows, and people's, suddenly views and everything being obscured. So there's a whole lot of people, and again, it's different bits. For someone in Auckland, it might be, suddenly seeing a monsterity go up next door, to someone in farming, to seeing a pine plantation, and they look at it and they see it's a fuel keg ready to ignite over the summer at any time. So it's
Yeah.
going to be different things for different people that hurt them, but ultimately we are all being herded down the same path, and
Yeah.
people will find common ground.
And that's what they're talking about here now. It's the 15-minute neighborhoods, and people are really concerned. But they talk about it, they talk about it in the plans as being a lovely thing. You can just walk and get anything you want in your local community, which we basically have, in the Central Coast. Most of our areas do have some local shops that can supply enough of, small businesses that can supply enough. And then when they have the mixed dwellings, so the mixed dwellings is in every country that I've seen, and it's fast tracking development. So I guess when the lovely picture that's painted in the government plans becomes a nightmare reality, and you actually see that they might plan, and then they do talk about traffic calming measures. We haven't seen it implemented yet, but they call it traffic calming. Private car ownerships on the last, it's the last rung down. Everything else, there was a Central Coast Transport Plan from state government due last Friday. And the thing, we wrote a submission, but it's basically like, until you start giving the full picture to the public, you're not giving the full picture. You're not giving the intersection between digital ID, central bank digital currency, carbon credits. You're not telling people what this actually is. You're just talking one plan over here, one plan over there. They're all connected. And it somehow seems to be like hours and hours and hours every week trying to piece all of this together to help people understand what's happening.
You have to sort of acknowledge that this has been really, really well done. I have a grudging admiration for the way this has been carried out. And, we do live in interesting times. There'll be times when I have the occasional pity party of one, very rare. But on the whole, I am seeing encouraging signs in New Zealand. Maybe it's because we've been hammered so hard. Maybe because it's now very obvious. This morning, the news, I don't have the news at home, a bit somewhere on Facebook, cut off the TV 2 years ago, thank goodness. And they have set forth a separate Maori disaster relief fund. Now, for the average Kiwi, this is getting a bit too hard to, just go along that, all right, we don't want to be racist, but hello.
Yeah.
The cyclone ravaged everyone. What is this supposed to mean here?
Yeah.
And suddenly people are questioning. We've got a healthcare system, separate one, set up on the basis of ethnicity.
Yeah.
But it doesn't answer the fundamental question. Who is eligible to go there? What is the threshold? How much ancestry, Maori ancestry, do I need to show to be eligible? 1%, 2, 3, 5, 50? Because there has been intermarrying. There have been relatively good race relations for quite a few decades. So what are you going to do? I have families, a mate of mine who came along to a council meeting, and she said, so suddenly, and she's Maori, her husband's a white guy. She says, so suddenly my vote is worth more than his.
Yeah.
Why?
So where do you see, because this is happening in a lot of countries, a lot of Western countries. So, and this is a United Nations agenda as well, isn't it? So can you speak to a little bit about what this is really about?
I have seen this, Kate, in India growing up, politicians have always used religion. You pit against Sikhs against Muslims, Hindus against the Christians, and the Christians are converting, missionaries are converting Hindus, and all that nonsense. And it is but obvious that when religion is not that big in the West, unlike in India, so ethnicity, the amount of melanin between you and me, let that be a bone of contention. And that has gone a bit too far, suddenly a bit too far, because inch by inch, the way it's coming, you are slowly, and I'm seeing that in the US, where you are having African Americans people of color speak up that I didn't want this. You're suddenly, painting all of my friends as enemies. And it's reached the same state of stupid here because I can say things sober now that my white friends can't, even 2 or 3 drinks down. What gives? I never thought I'd be in this position, but honestly, that's what it's come to. And that is the United Nations suddenly pitting you against the others, your fellow countrymen, your neighbor, it could be, someone you work for. And meanwhile, the agenda carries on. But for me, it's a sinking sense of deja vu. I'm back where I came from. It has come here. And I have lived through the 1984 Sikh riots in India. I was very small then, 4. But in one day, figures vary, between 8,000 to 12,000 Sikhs were killed in India by mobs that were led by politicians because Sikh bodyguards had killed Mrs. Gandhi. So they let loose prisoners from India's Alcatraz, the Tihar jail, and told them that for every head of a Sikh that you get, these many years off your prison sentence. So these things are very disturbing to me, honestly, with my background, whatever we are seeing. So there's no way I could be silent on these. And
I just wanted to say it's been such a pleasure talking to you and learning more about where you've come from. And I think I'd love to stay in touch because it's so much to get your head around, isn't it? I mean, I don't know how you're going. You seem to have a really good grasp of everything. I'm still trying to put the puzzle pieces together and work out what's happening.
I have lived 30 years out of my 44 under the shadow of the UN. It is like sort of, I can't seem to escape it.
Yeah, but is it like just a playbook that just keeps rolling out?
Rolling out, no matter where I am. That's what I said. One can run, but you can't hide. And there came a point I'm like, fuck it. I'm just
But do
gonna.
you think, are they using the same playbook over and over again that they've used for 30, 40 years? It's the same story.
Yes. Decimate agriculture, race relations have to be there, or in India, religious issues. Decimate agriculture and then make it all about the climate. I mean, this is the 3 thing.
And then everything becomes corporate owned by a very, very...
Farming has to be destroyed. Farming, then comes the climate issue, and then comes the race or religious issues there. Get those, forward, get the passion up there, get people up in arms against each other. So divided nations.
Yep. Instead of realizing it's 0.01% who are profiting and accumulating more power and control, because that's what's happened over the last 3 years. They have exponentially, their wealth has gone up exponentially. It's a real pleasure to meet you online and you.
I'm so glad I saw that notification on Facebook and I got in touch.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you did. And I was just so thrilled that because I've been wanting to focus on farming and really concerned about farmers. And I've been following the CSIRO and the synthetic biology and the CRISPR technology and the Gates, with the Impossible Burgers. And I've just been Beyond Meats and all this synthetic food. And then just, once you remove people's capacity to have a little plot of land or, like to be able to have their own home, we're very, very vulnerable to, like having
to tyranny, because then we don't have anything.
So thank you for everything you're doing. And it's a wonderful pleasure to meet you.
Likewise, right back at you. It's good to find people out on the same path.